Hey everyone, welcome to Unlearning Youth Group. We're the podcast where we take a look at all the things we learned back in youth group, find the good, unlearn the bad, and figure out where the heck we go from here. If we haven't met, my name is Jonathan Carone, and we're joined as always by our co-host, Mr. Eric Williams. Eric, go ahead and say hey to the people.
Today's going to be another spicy one. I feel like it's going to be spicy. So, hey people, right now I'm just going to drop a mother reference right now, and then if you understand that reference later on, you can laugh and chuckle.
It's going to go there, isn't it?
Okay, so I've run out of my typical coffee that I normally get. So this is on no coffee. So this is going to be even better. This is the caffeine of the Holy Spirit, my man. You're getting it.
Okay. Well, hey, before we get into today's topic, here's a quick reminder. We are on YouTube this season. If you want to watch us, go ahead. You can click the link down in the description of the podcast, or you can go to youtube.com/@unlearningyouthgroup to watch it over there. Subscribe, leave us a comment, let us know you're watching. But for today's topic, this one requires some setup as to why we're talking about it. But I think it's an important thing for us to talk about, so follow along.
Yep.
Essentially, this is a part 2 of an episode that we did last year called Can Boys and Girls Just Be Friends? And ultimately we said that yes, boys and girls can be just friends, and we should normalize non-romantic relationships between young people. That episode was focused mainly on unmarried people in their teens and 20s. But today is going to be focused more on us, the people who are listening to this now that probably are married or are a little older. Or you're getting into more of serious relationships as you do get older, more so than leading the next generation. And because of that, what happened was last August, megachurch pastor, as Eric would say, friend of the show, Matt Chandler was he was suspended from his church. And if you're not a church nerd like us, you probably don't know the full story, but it's been a massive marketing and communication failure with how they've talked about it. But if we take the church at face value, and if we give them the benefit of the doubt, here is what happened. Matt Chandler, who is married, he had a friendship with a woman who was also married. Chandler's wife.
I'm making the sound for all of the like hardcore conservative evangelicals that are like, for shame, they already know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this friendship involved text messages or DMs, and Chandler's wife knew about the messages and the friendship between him and this woman, and she was okay with it.
But not a Jerry situation.
I almost made the joke. I was going to wait a couple minutes. The woman's
it's not a
husband,
reverse Jerry situation where Matt's wife is just in the background with the DMs reading them third person. Okay. Got it.
The woman's husband knew about the friendship and the messages, and she was okay with it. But a friend of the woman found out about the messages and was not okay with the relationship and the messages that were being sent. And so the friend confronted Chandler after a church service, and he then took it to his elder board. The elder board came out and said that the relationships and the messages were not sexual and they were not romantic at all. Yet in his release to the church, Chandler said he was being suspended because of the, quote, frequency and familiarity of the messages, and that they were, quote, unguarded and unwise. So there are a few words to point out. It's that frequency and familiarity that implies that they routinely message each other and were very comfortable with each other. They were friends.
Yep. Well, he was also, I think, just for other context too, like he had admitted that maybe there were some like crass jokes and humor. So when I see familiarity, it's like he talked in a way to this person that he would not talk in public. You know, that sense of familiarity. Like, oh, I can say that to you, but I can't say it to other people.
Yep. The post-show conversations that
Eric and I had, but I mean, that you're right. That implies that they're friends, because there are things that you'll say to your friends, or I mean, you know, like I think just the other day, like you sent me a joke that you're like, oh, I was thinking about posting that publicly, but I know that like it's something that only you and I would find funny, you know, or very few people. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly right.
Or I know your sensibilities are okay with that joke. So
right. Yeah. You're not going to take
I'm not going to cuss on. It's the reason we very rarely cuss on this podcast, because we don't know the sensibilities of you, the listener. You might be
Yep.
offended by that. And so we're not going to do that. But
Yep.
to each other, we'll drop some 4-letter words because they're
Sure.
funny sometimes. So if we give the church the benefit of the doubt, the way that I interpret the story is that Matt Chandler essentially broke what is known as the Billy Graham
Billy
rule. And Eric, I'm
Graham
going to let you
rule. I was ready for like the
I'm going to
Billy
let you
Graham
explain what the Billy
rule. Sorry. Yeah, Billy Graham rule. Okay, so the Billy Graham rule, what most people know it as the Billy Graham rule, was really established as part of the Modesto Manifesto, which is like when Billy Graham was launching his public ministry. If you haven't read his or his biography, it's great. So you can listen to that and kind of get some more background. But what we know as the Billy Graham rule was actually part of 4 agreements in Billy Graham's ministries as the partners were getting ready to establish their specific ministry. And so some of you younger listeners, you might know the Billy Graham rule as the Mike Pence rule, because during, I don't know if it was during the campaign or something else like that, that was something that famously came out because he followed what we know as the Billy Graham rule. So there were 4 Billy Graham rules, if you think about it. There was one about money because they were starting this evangelical, televangelist traveling ministry thing, and they wanted to stay above board about money because other evangelists, televangelists, and traveling guys like that were abusing money, passing the plate, and taking advantage of people. So that was one. The other one was about the local church because there were a lot of, traveling evangelists that would come in, just trash the local church. And they wanted to make sure they stayed above board and had really great relationships with the local church, which if you know anything about Billy Graham, if you know anything about his ministry, yeah, he was always lifting up the local church. He didn't want you to follow him around like some kind of carny or something like that, like be
Hey,
involved
can I
in
give a
local
fun
church.
fact about
Yeah.
that toots my own horn?
Sure.
I built the website for the church that Billy Graham was a member at when he died.
There you go. Look at that. It's like the
okay.
7 degrees of Kevin Bacon and or Billy Graham. The third one, which is actually the fourth one, but I'm skipping the most important one, right, is they had a rule about not exaggerating the numbers because they did notice that, the reporting, they didn't want to do anything that, caused the press to be suspicious. So none of this like modern elevation worship where it's like, hey, we got people that have already been baptized, but they're going to stand up and come to the front, that encourages other people to start coming, or if you've ever been a part of a church and it's like, oh, we're going to count the number of hands raised for decisions, or we're going to count the attendance. And it was always a little heavy on the old count. We're going to add, or let's add about 10% for the ones that I didn't see, or they put their hand down first. So money, the local church, exaggerating the numbers. And then what we know as the Billy Graham rule was about their interactions with members of the opposite sex, because Billy Graham actually wrote that he and all the other people in the group, they knew evangelists that have fallen into sexual temptation because they're traveling all the time and they're away from their families and they're going from, town to town, and they're spending long periods of time away from their wife. So that's what came up as to be known as the Billy Graham rule. We're not sitting here focusing on like money, the local church, or exaggerating our numbers. We're focused on the Billy Graham rule.
And it came out of a very specific situation responding to very specific actions that had happened. So it was very contextualized, and it essentially said that married men should avoid spending time alone with women they are not married to as a means of avoiding sexual temptation or any appearance of doing something that might be considered morally objectionable.
They used they used 2 Timothy 1:22, which talks about fleeing youthful lusts. That was kind of their cornerstone verse: flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord of a pure heart. So that was kind of their proof texting to say this is why it's important.
And in the context of traveling around the country and other televangelists having moral failures and going outside their marriage, that was hurting the way people were listening to or considering the church, this made sense. But what has happened is in the time since then, we took and we being the church at large, took an idea for a specific time and a specific reason and have applied that across the board. And we now say that men and women can't be friends, or married men cannot be friends with a woman who is not his spouse. And we've taken that so far that this entire situation with Matt Chandler, essentially he broke the Billy Graham rule and was suspended for a few months because of that.
Yeah.
And there's a thread, Eric, I sent you last week on Twitter of this guy railing against why men and women can't be friends. And I was amazed by the amount of people who were agreeing with it and how viscerally they were agreeing with it, and saying that they were calling men who had female friends that weren't their spouse, they were calling them fools.
Yep.
And it's an age old debate. Can married men be friends with someone of the opposite sex outside their marriage? And here's what I find really interesting. Logically, this question goes both ways. Can married women be friends with men who are not their husband? But that's never asked. No one inside the church ever assumes that if a woman is friends with a man who is not her husband, that something nefarious is going on. It's only the opposite direction.
Yeah. Yeah, it is weird because the weird thing is it's vilified the woman on either side. It's like the man is stupid, but the woman could be that that it could be that Jezebel situation. It's like she's going to tempt you or anything else like that. And I think when we talk about this, what ends up getting lost is we say, can men in general, can every man be friends with every woman who's not their spouse? And that's what's so tough, because I think when we talk about, we'll get into the good and the bad, but I think we lose it in a lot of different areas that we've talked about this season specifically, because I would say, can Eric specifically be friends with every woman who's not my spouse? No, I cannot. No. In fact, specifically at one of the churches I was working with, there have been other women that I'm like, I will tell my wife specifically, I'm intentionally trying to avoid her because that does not seem like a healthy friendship because of the way that she talks about these things or anything else. Sure, right? That is great. Nor do I want to be friends with every woman. But there's a difference between okay, all right, I'll go into the story. So we used to lock up at one of the churches that I worked at, because we'd be working late and we'd be locking up, anything else like that. And that was one of the things where it's like, if you and it was like one other member of the opposite sex, and if you were alone, somebody else had to stay or somebody had to leave before you did, or it got really weird, which we'll talk about why that's a problem in the future. But for some reason, there was a woman who was overseeing our community care, so the one that would send the flowers to the hospitals and, all that kind of stuff. She was amazing. I have no idea how old she was. She was old enough to be my grandmother. And for some reason, she was essentially grandmothered in on this rule where it didn't matter. If I was closing up alone with any other woman, it was not okay. But if I was closing up alone and she was there, and I don't want to name her, but the people that have worked with me, they know who she is. It was like nobody cared. And so even then, there's this little we even excuse that because it's like, oh, you can be alone with that woman, that's fine, no big deal,
because she's not a sexual temptation. We're
yes.
judging a woman based on her age and probably looks. Oh, that woman's not a sexual temptation, so you can be alone with her.
She's fine. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Or on the opposite side, which we'll talk about why this is bad. It's like, Eric would have to be really bad to want to, do something on that. It's like, oh God, either way, you are dehumanizing the two people involved when talking about this.
Yep. And before we move into the good and the bad, I do want to just set this out on the front end. I've been really purposely trying to use more scripture this season than in past ones, because one of the biggest questions or feedback that I've gotten over the past few years is people asking where I got an idea from in scripture. So I've been trying to throw those things out more this season, but I'm not going to do that this episode, because there is scripture to proof text that this is a good idea and it's a bad idea. And I think it's in bad faith for me to try and pick and choose text to back up my argument. I could have done that. I actually started out doing that, and then I got into it and I felt icky because I'm like, no, wait, this isn't right. So we're not going to do that in this episode. We're going to talk more socially, more psychologically, sociology, and with faith as the backbone of that. So if you want to dive in more scripture, you can send me a message, but we're not going to do a ton of that in this episode. But as we move forward, Eric, what did we get right about applying the Billy Graham rule outside of his organization? What was the good intention underlying that?
I appreciate we go right into the right after you just opted out every single one of our Theo bro people that are like, oh, you're not going to use scripture to back it up? Well, then I'm out because this isn't going to, whatever. Anyway, so what did we get right? Theo bro, stay in here. I think, if we think about what the Billy Graham rule is trying to do, go for the intention of that. They had seen a bunch of people that they knew in their same position that were disqualified from ministry, which is another, evangelical buzzword, disqualified from ministry because of affairs that have happened, because emotional affairs had led to actual physical intimacy type of affairs. And it's like, was it wise? It's wise to put those guardrails in place. I think in general, there is a wisdom guardrail to say, hey, it's probably not a great idea for you to intentionally put yourself in positions where you might be tempted.
Yeah, that's a wise thing to do. Right? Because if we're honest with each other, close relationships, close friendships between men and women outside of marriage can very easily get to places they shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about this in previous episodes, this idea of guardrails versus roadblocks, but you can do something that is not biblically wrong or sinful over and over and over, and then find yourself very quickly one step away from something that's absolutely wrong.
Yep.
You can say, hey, this thing, like us going to dinner together, that's not wrong. Like we're working together. We're hungry. It makes sense.
Right.
But then we got to go back to the office and we got to finish working. That's not
Right.
wrong either. But then you do this over and over and over, and you're at an office late at night together and you're tired and you've been sharing things and with each
Yeah.
other, and you're really close to something that's going to be really wrong.
Well,
by
and
doing
to
nothing
that
that was
point too,
wrong in
like
the first
what you
place.
said, like in general, we work together. Hey, let's go grab lunch and then come back. In general, for most people in most situations, fine. But there are situations where it's like that may not be okay. And I think, you've got some examples, but for me personally, if there are situations where my wife says, hey, you know what? I don't feel comfortable with this interaction that you have with this person, or I don't feel comfortable in this situation, or if there's anything that I'm doing that's making my wife suspicious of anything, obviously we got to work that through. But like personally, me as Eric, not saying it works for everybody, I'm going to go above and beyond to say, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that my wife feels confident? I mean, for instance, I work at home. I'm at home all day, all by myself. I'm a big boy. I can handle myself. I'm at home all day. But like, what are some protections that we're putting in place to make sure that my wife feels comfortable while she's at work? And so those are some different things in interactions. It's like, she hasn't said anything, but it's like, we got a Ring doorbell camera. She knows every time somebody comes near our house. So it's like, she knows if I'm leaving, she knows I'm good. Not that she looks at it, but it's like, there's some things that like for us in our individual situation,
there are
maybe
guardrails.
It makes more sense. Yeah. Maybe it makes more sense to establish those guardrails essentially for peace of mind more than anything else.
And one of the places that I think the Billy Graham rule really helps is a place that we don't talk about a lot when it comes to marriages, and that's emotional affairs.
Yeah.
Because we focus on physical affairs, but emotional affairs are what leads to the physical affair most of the time. There's studies that estimate between 50 and 70% of all emotional affairs eventually lead to physical affairs. And personally, my wife has told me that she thinks if I were to have an emotional affair with someone, that would be more hurtful to her than if I were to have a physical affair. Yeah. And I don't know, I can't make a global statement that all women feel that way, but in my situation, that having that conversation with her, it's like, okay, there does need to be a guardrail in place so that I don't get anywhere close to emotional affair. That doesn't mean I can't be friends,
right,
or friendly, but I can't, like, I have to protect against that because those things happen very easily amongst friendships, amongst like-minded people who spend time together. So protecting yourself and your marriage from that is extremely important to do. And I think the Billy Graham rules started as something to do that.
So for some people, I really love that you brought up this idea of like physical affair is obvious, but that's not it. I mean, because like physical affair, but it doesn't have to be a situation where like tab A goes into slot B for that to be crossing the line for some people. I mean, it could be more than that, where an emotional affair could actually be either just as damaging or more damaging, or at least don't say that like, well, it's okay. And, you've brought it up in other situations before, but the idea of like a work wife, my work wife is back here, but behind me laying down on her dog bed, my dog Luna. But that's the type of thing where what happens
Mine's
is
upstairs.
you end up, right. Well, you end up getting into these situations like maybe what a Chandler did, which again, it's not sexual, but it's maybe unwise. And so for other things, guardrails, like my wife has every password of everything on my phone. She never ever goes into it or looks on it. There's no sense of we're surveying each other. But the bottom line is, if she wanted to see what my DMs look like, she could look into my DMs. She want to see all my text messages,
Absolutely.
all the photos I've taken. My computer here is not password protected. Anytime she wanted, she could say, hey, you know what? I need to ask. And it's not because like, oh, I need her checking on me. But again, it's that, I don't know if you had this rule growing up, but for me, when I was growing up, especially in high school, if I had a girl over, the door had to be open in my room, or we weren't allowed to be in my room, those sorts of things. Like as a parent, you immediately get that. They're like, that doesn't stop them from doing things, but of course that makes it more transparent. And so having those guardrails is a good idea, at least to just be like, hey, that could also reveal an initial step leading towards an emotional affair. Because all of a sudden, if I start password protecting something, or I download a new messenger app that she doesn't know about, now are those the small, tiny steps towards I'm going to start talking to somebody and continue, an emotional relationship.
Yep. And we'll get into the details of those type of things when we figure out where we go from here. But now that we've talked about what was good about the Billy Graham rule, let's talk about what was bad, because there have been some bad implications and some bad things that have happened because of that. And the thing I would lead with is that it makes an assumption that a lot of the things we're unlearning this season are true. It assumes that everyone is wired the exact same way. So we have to put in the same hard and fast rules for everyone.
Yep.
Every person is tempted in the same way by the same thing. And so this rule has to apply to everyone. Every marriage has the exact same issues. And so they have to follow the exact same rules.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is, with so many other things we've been talking about, it puts in roadblocks instead of putting in guardrails.
Yep.
And it creates issues that wouldn't, in an attempt to help an issue, it causes more issues that are just as harmful in different ways.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that I really didn't even think about it until very recently, especially as we're talking about this. It almost hides deeper relational issues. Okay. Here's what I mean by that. If our family is a hard and fast Mike Pence, Billy Graham, can only eat dinner with mother type of rule family, then what that might do is it might hide the fact that maybe our communication between spouses isn't that great. Because it's a little bit different for me to be able to say, hey, I don't know, like this is happening. I know this person, this is going on, like having an open conversation around it, because it's a guardrail instead of a rule. Because when you put a rule in there and you're like, oh, though, I just know that this is the rule and they're not going to break it. So the only answer you have, which if you go back to the whole meaning of guardrails, Andy Stanley's series way back when, it's to prevent you, guardrails stop you from falling into danger. And so if the only answer is either where no danger or danger, there's nothing in between to help stop you from getting there, which means like it doesn't require conversation. Whereas now, since my wife and I don't have like a hard and fast Billy Graham rule, it's great conversation. Hey, I'm going out. Here's who I'm going out with. This is what I'm doing, and all that sort of thing, because I'm just open. Or, hey, I want to let you know, I don't feel comfortable interacting with this person that often because, this or that or the other. Like it opens up conversations. And I can also ask her too, like, hey, are you sure you're comfortable with me doing this or engaging in that? And so now I'm opening conversation instead of lying on this rule. But really, there are if you think about the people that are Billy Graham rule haters, so to speak, they bring up three different issues. Issue number one, it prevents people from doing their jobs or living their life. So if you can't have a friend that's a member of the opposite sex, or specifically if you can't be around them, then like at church and ministry, Or if you're working and you're a Christian with a deeply held belief, it can be impossible to lead as a manager a group of mixed gendered individuals. I even think today I went to the doctor. My doctor, I was in the room alone with the nurse and the nurse practitioner, both of whom were women. And it's like, that would be impossible to live life that way for most people, or you make it extremely difficult.
Well, here's another version of that.
Go ahead, yeah.
Here's another version of that real quick. So we're contractually obligated to say we work in marketing.
Yep.
And so one of the things that happens with that is people want to work with us to help them make their businesses better.
Yeah.
And back when I lived in Knoxville, there were multiple times that a woman who I knew would reach out to me and say, hey, can you help me with this thing for my business? And because we lived in the same town, we would want to meet up at a coffee shop or a Panera or whatever it might be to talk through what this could look like or to give ideas. It was before the pandemic, so Zoom wasn't as big of a thing.
Yeah.
And we would have these conversations. And if we lived by a hard and fast Billy Graham rule, I couldn't have those conversations in those public places because I didn't want people to possibly think, well, why is he having lunch with another woman who's his age but isn't his wife?
Yep.
That's one of the things the Billy Graham rule protects against. My wife knew about it,
right,
and I made sure she was comfortable with me going to lunch with that person. But I said, hey, this is what we're talking about. This is where we will be. This is what we are doing.
Yeah.
And it would have kept me from helping another small business owner if I couldn't meet with her on her own, because we would have had to find someone else to come be our third wheel chaperone,
right,
while we ate lunch at Panera.
And that, that was so tough. Like as a youth pastor or as a student ministry pastor, like you couldn't give rides to anybody. You couldn't, like, all of that was just so tough. And yeah, I mean, even if someone was broken down or, if it's raining or anything like that, like no emergency situation would be okay for that. The other side is like other than my wife and my dad, like my wife, my dad, and my sister are like my best friends. Like I talk to them about everything. My sister and I are very close. My sister is 7 years younger than me. She's a little taller than my wife and blonde, like my wife. And so it's like anytime I would be driving around where my sister and I would be going somewhere, to the gym or wherever, right? It's like at one of the churches that I work at.
You're laughing with this blonde chick in your car who's younger
right,
than your
exactly.
wife. What are people going to think?
That you're comfortable with, right? Because she's my sister. You know what I mean? And like we grew up doing sports and everything else like that. And all of a sudden now you start getting like, oh, who is Eric with? And it's like, do we have to have like a blood test? Well, first of all, she's adopted, so blood test wouldn't matter anyway. But like, do you have to have like a blood test or a DNA test to be like, oh, I'm allowed to hang around with this person because and how far does it go? Can you hang around with your aunt? I've seen other people that literally they will post online. They're like, you should not be hanging out with anyone other than your spouse, including your aunt.
Let me jump in.
Your grandma.
I think most of us would say that, of course, you can hang out with your sister, but people who follow the Billy Graham rule, if they see you in public with someone, they're making a judgment because of that. So what this does, another bad piece of this is, it causes us to think the worst in people and automatically assume that something nefarious is going on because two people who may be married to someone else are meeting together for lunch or coffee or somewhere in public together.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or here's another version of that. We've mentioned here, my wife is a nurse. Her work hours are crazy.
Right.
I go to the park with my kids so that they can play on the playground.
Yep.
And I'm there with another mom who I am friends with because I've known her since high school. Yeah. We didn't plan to go there together. Right. We just happened to show up at the same time, and we're sitting on a park bench together while our kids are playing, and we're having an adult conversation because God only knows parents value adult conversations when they're with their kids all the time.
Yeah.
The Billy Graham rule would say that is inappropriate.
Yeah.
And that should not be happening because people might think something else is going on, or it might look like something else is going on if we sat on a park bench together in public with someone who is not my wife.
Yeah, we end up elevating perception over reality, which, yes, perception is important because people's perception becomes a reality. I understand that. But what that also does is it inadvertently feeds into some of our church cover-up problem, where it's like, well, what did it look like? What did it seem like? What do we act like? Instead of finding the facts and waiting and be slow to judgment, right? You should be slow to judgment, slow to make that judgment on what it should be. So yeah, I 100% agree. In fact, side note, speaking to last week's episode, speaking to purity culture issues, I want to know, is that kind of like the male version? Like, we joke about wearing gray sweatpants, but more so as a male, if you're going to the park with your kids and maybe a puppy, right? And you're actually like well groomed, are you thirst trapping at that point? So
I don't know.
maybe men, we need to be a little bit more modest when taking our kids to the park and not seem like such good fathers and good human beings. Okay. Because you don't want your sisters in Christ.
Wouldn't want to tempt the other moms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, I just, okay, moving on. So the second thing that it does, and I think you mentioned a little bit before, but it perpetuates this narrative that people are unable to control themselves from acting on sexual impulses. And in fact, during the Mike Pence thing, Caitlin Beatty, which she's an author and an editor at, I don't know, at the Brazos Press. Anyway, she wrote this. She said, the Pence Rule, which is the Billy Graham rule, the Pence Rule arises from a broken view of the sexes. Men are lustful beasts that must be contained, while women are objects of desire that must be hidden away. Offering the Pence Rule as a solution to male predation is like saying, I can't meet with you one-on-one, otherwise I might eventually assault you. If that's the case, we have far deeper problems around men and power than any personal conduct rule can solve. So that's going back to your statement. It's like, it's not like every single man has this issue. And it's also not like every single woman who's meeting with a married man wants to go out and be an adulteress and like steal some man away.
Right. Not every woman's a harlot, Eric. Not every woman wants to go out and break up other marriages and break up her own marriage.
Exactly. So then the other thing is it can systematically deprive women of access, of power, and of agency. So obviously, if it's hard to do your job, you think about it, that was the big pushback against the whole Pence thing, is like, if he can't take meetings with women by themselves, then that means that they don't have the same sort of access to someone in power. So they don't have the same sort of access to maybe promotions. They don't have that same sort of access to moving up. So women just don't get that same access when we have this Billy Graham rule in play. And for our society right now, because the majority of managers, of CEOs, of anything else like that are male, let's say lead pastors are male, that naturally creates a disadvantage for women in workplaces even. And so that's where partially wrong. So I'll just summarize all this. Is Daniel Strickland, who's like one of my favorite speakers, she said, to create safe boundaries for your life and ministry is a good idea. But taking the ones created for a specific set of circumstances at a certain point in time for a specific person and applying them to your life and ministry today is unhelpful. And in today's world, it's actually harmful to women. So I love that she said that, because that's my whole thesis on this issue is, can men and women be friends? Yes. Can every man be friends with every woman? No. Should we create a rule because of certain individual situations? No. Like, do the work to actually create boundaries and guardrails in your own personal life. So, Jonathan, how the heck do we move forward from here?
Well, I joked before we started that this season and last season has kind of been like, the tagline to our show should be "Make Nuance Great Again," because that's kind of what we're talking about here. Because
don't try to sound that out on a hat like it's not MAGA. Don't do the MAGA version of that, because I tried it a couple of times and I'll get canceled for that for sure.
oh! I just realized what that was.
Yep. Yeah, you just did it in your head. Yeah,
I did.
Yeah, you got canceled in your head. Way to go.
Okay, before I got to tell a quick story. The church I worked at was called Two Rivers Church, and we did our abbreviation was the number 2 RC, and we did an event with high school and middle school ministry together. And when we did that, we would call it Two Rivers Church Student Ministries. And when we went in color, it was fine. I would do 2RC in one color and SM in another color.
Okay.
Well, we did a worship night one time, and I very quickly threw together a 2RC SM graphic to throw on the back screen, but it was all in white. and I didn't realize what it was saying. I didn't notice this until one of our other volunteers saw it and legit started laughing. And I didn't know why. He's like, read that.
Yeah.
Now imagine it's a license plate because I still didn't get it.
Yeah.
I put "to racism" on the back of a church wall.
Well, and in that era, that was probably really, that was part of the era of like removing vowels to make
Right.
things, like reverb was RVB or whatever, you know what I mean?
RVRB.
RVRB,
yeah.
That's
so
funny.
That's just a funny little story. But where do we go from here? We put this episode right here for a very specific reason. 2 weeks ago in our episode about alcohol, we talked about how each of us have different temptations and triggers that we have to be aware of and protect ourselves against. Your temptation may not be my temptation, and my temptation may not be yours. And so it's not as much about right or wrong in this case as it is wise and unwise.
Right.
And then last week we talked about pursuing biblical sexual integrity. That means that we chase the ideals God has laid before us sexually. So with those two things in mind, Eric, we get to play our favorite new game. Is it sinful, stupid or acceptable
with self-control?
So there is a line that you can cross with a friend that is absolutely sinful. That is that emotional affair. That is wrong. There are things in a friendship that can be stupid and can lead you to places that are sinful. But ultimately, most relationships with members of the opposite sex are going to be acceptable with self-control. The friendships, like we've mentioned before, they need to be out in the open.
Yep.
Your spouse should know about them. They should know about the conversations you have. They should be comfortable with the relationship. If your spouse is not comfortable with the relationship, your allegiance should be to your spouse. You are to love your spouse above everyone else except for Jesus. You're to sacrifice your desires for them. If your spouse is uncomfortable with the relationship with someone, regardless of the gender, but especially with the opposite gender, you owe it to them to listen to the concern.
Yep.
My wife, her dad had multiple affairs when she was younger. It came to a head when she was in middle school, and it led to her parents getting divorced and some really hard times and some things that she's still having to unpack in therapy and other stuff from that. And because of that, she's naturally concerned about that happening. And her mind goes there in ways that someone without that past, like my parents, I don't know of any type of affairs or anything like that in their past. So my mind doesn't even go there a lot of times, but hers does because of her past experience. And as her husband, I owe it to her to do everything I can to make sure she's comfortable with the friendships I have. It's a way for me to sacrifice and to serve for her out of my love for her. And as I was getting ready for this episode, I was trying to do some research, and I came across an article that was written by a guy named Greg Smalley, and it was written for Focus on the Family.
So he disagreed, right? He was like totally against.
I thought he would absolutely disagree because it was focused on the family.
That's funny.
But I was shocked that he actually agreed with the point that I just made. And he wrote a really great quote in that article that said, if your spouse raises concerns, you might think about it this way. You can be a great driver, but it still doesn't hurt to have a car with anti-lock brakes. You can be a talented woodworker, but you should still wear safety glasses when you're working with a lathe. And it's the same with opposite sex friendships. Safety first. So like you mentioned earlier, Eric, your spouse should have access to the text messages that you send. They should be able to see them at any time. And that's not a matter of control or not trusting. It's simply not hiding things from your spouse because you love them more than your relationship with the friend.
And I'll say this too,
if you're uncomfortable
in our conversation about hiding other issues, for some people are like, oh man, my husband would take advantage of that and would be spying on me, or my wife would be all up in my business. Friends, that is a different issue. That is a different issue. Don't go, oh no, I can't give them, I can't leave it password. I can't give them the passwords because they'd abuse it. Bro, that is a problem that you need to work out.
That's an issue for another day.
Right, with your spouse. That does not give you license to not have a guardrail in place. That's like saying, I can't wear a seatbelt because it kind of cuts into my neck right here a little bit. It's like, no,
because if I were to get into a wreck, it could chop my head off.
Yeah, right.
That's why I'm not going to wear a seatbelt. What? Come on. Like, again, make nuance great again. Let's understand that not every situation can be applied to everything, but in
Right.
general, we should be comfortable letting our spouse in on these relationships. And if
Yeah.
you're not comfortable letting them in, then that should raise some red flags about whether you've moved into the stupid or sinful portions of this game,
Yeah.
or if you have deeper seated relationship issues with your
That's the
spouse.
thing. I mean, Jonathan, honestly, if my wife wants to see the dumb text messages you and I send back and forth, like, have at it. I'm going to be more embarrassed by she'll probably be like, what do you do all day?
Yeah. But no, I'll give you some examples. I have a friend who is a former church staffer as well. It's a female. And we are pretty closely tied on political issues, and she cares about politics in a way that my wife doesn't care about politics.
Yeah.
So we have a relationship where we can talk about church things and we can talk about politics in a way that my wife just doesn't care.
Yep.
And so we talk about those things. I'll be glad to let my wife see every single one of those text messages.
Yeah.
But it's a conversation that my wife doesn't want to know about, or excuse me, that she doesn't want to be a part of.
She doesn't,
because
she doesn't have interest in.
it's not something she is interested in. And
right.
I can have a friend who has a common thing that we're interested in that we talk about together, or I have friends that I knew from Liberty who
Yep.
I was friends with before my wife and I got together.
Yep.
I'm not going to be someone that tells you have to kill off all your past friendships. No,
Yeah.
just put a guardrail around it.
Right. Well, and that's the other thing is like, I've heard this argument before. So I'm in the same situation where like, I've got 2 or 3 either former coworkers or friends or, whatever you want to call them, like that are women that are really good copywriters or really good idea people or, really good in the industry that I'm in, that I'll go back and forth and I'll, chat with like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? Do you have any ideas for this? I'm looking for that. And they're just really great to bounce stuff off of. So the hardcore Billy Graham rule person or the hardcore like men and women can't be friends would say, well, Eric, wouldn't it be just wiser to find a male version of that? Okay, maybe.
Talent is talent.
But let's go all the way back to what's wrong. That prevents people from doing work. Problem with the first issue. The second issue is like, if you have that big of a problem, maybe that's an issue for you. And then the third problem, I'm like, now what conversations, and I'm not saying like I'm, access to power, but what conversations am I now preventing those very talented people from being involved in if I'm like, nope, can't talk to you because I'm disqualifying you from those conversations because you're women.
Here's another one. Eric, I know your wife's a teacher and you handle the morning stuff before school with your kids.
All the time.
I handle the morning things, the drop-offs, the pickups from daycare. I do the baths or showers a lot of times. A lot of those things that are traditional wife, mother roles. The way our marriage works out and our family works out is I do a lot of those.
Same.
So I relate a lot to the stay-at-home mom social media content.
Oh yeah.
Or those type of things. So when I see a friend of mine who is a mom post similar things, I will joke with her about that because it's a shared life experience
right.
that my wife just doesn't have.
Right.
Because of the way our family is set up.
Right.
And to say I can't have those type of friendly relationships, that I think that's stupid.
Right.
Quite frankly. Like
again, to say you can't is stupid.
Yeah.
So there might be somebody out there that's like, sure, if sexual sin is your main
hey, you know who I'm not going to have those conversations with? Ex-girlfriends.
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah.
And,
exactly.
and people I've had intimate relationships with in the past.
Right.
I'm not going to continue that relationship in the same way. Like if they ever cross the line from friend to something more, I'm not going back to that out of respect for my wife because that is stupid. It's not quite sinful yet, but it is stupid.
Well, and that's what
so
my
I'm
wife
not going to go there.
We established this early in our relationship was like, hey, if we have marital problems, who are we not going to go to? We're not going to go to people that are not supportive of our marriage. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so there might be guardrails there where you set, and I've heard some people are like, I don't talk to people who are divorced about my marital issues. I don't talk to people who I've been, interested in the past about my marital issues. Because again, that's another area. So
I would be very cautious to talk to a woman about my marital issues as well.
Sure. Yeah. In general.
Because of how slippery that could be. And that's how my wife's father his affairs started multiple times.
Right.
Confiding in someone, helping someone go through something.
Yep.
And so I know right away that's a red flag for my wife she's uncomfortable with. And I know it's a stupid situation
That's
to put
unwise.
myself in
Yeah.
because I'm talking to a female about things that are wrong in my relationship.
So summarize it all. It's like some of these things are stupid for you or for me or for someone else, but that's where that open and honest conversation, if you are married with your spouse, needs to come in, and you talk about those things. You need to do what's best for your marriage and your situation and even your season, because there might be seasons where guys, where your wife is pregnant or postpartum, and it's like there might be more sensitivity around what Instagram people you follow, what you're looking at, any of that stuff that maybe in honor of her and her current situation needs to be tightened up or needs to be guardrailed a little bit more than in other situations. Like, you have to do what's best for you and your situation.
So ultimately, to answer the title of this episode, can married people be friends with someone of the opposite sex? My answer to that is a resounding yes. You can be friends with someone of the opposite sex. Now, should you be? And to what level you should be? That's between you and your spouse based on your own sensibilities, temptations, and past life experience in a way that is self-sacrificing and elevating the feelings of your partner above your own.
Yep.
So I can't tell you yes or no. That's up to you. Just like I can't tell you whether or not you can drink alcohol. That's up to you and your sensibilities. This whole idea of sinful, stupid, or acceptable with self-control, it started as a joke, but it's really a framework that you can take this entire conversation through to figure out, should you be friends with this person of the opposite sex once you are married?
Perfect.
So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to be taking the last few episodes and stacking them on top of each other to answer the question, when do we allow others to live in sin versus when do we step in and speak into issues that we see? For now, though, rate us and review us wherever you get podcasts. Subscribe and give us a comment on YouTube if you're watching us there. Share this episode with a friend if you found it interesting. If you have feedback or comments or questions, you can get in touch with us at hello@unlearningyouthgroup.com. Eric is at EricW712 on all the major platforms. I am at Jonathan_Caron on them as well. If you want to get your merch, or if you have a funny or awkward youth group story, you can send those and buy those at unlearningyouthgroup.com. But as always, thanks for making us a part of your day, and we will talk to you again next week.